Thank you. Honourable Minister, I enjoyed your speech in the three things you made. There's something you mentioned which I learned, the triple E, economy, ecology, and equity. That we've been talking about triple Ps, but that was interesting, and I think there's quite a lot in that what you said. You talked about, from the urbanization message you put forward, I see my role is new business. I look at business opportunities. I'm looking at housing. And I'm looking at, when you look at the urbanization of how many people you expect to be moving into the cities, what are the local laws in terms of home ownership? And we have a vibrant banking environment in Tanzania. But then you kind of hit me on the head when you talked about the land, the fact that 70% of the land now is owned by the communities. And now, if somebody is looking now to look in terms of real estate, to develop a real estate business really to cater for these millions of people coming into the urban cities, how does that actually work? I mean, yes, it's good for the, in terms of the equity from your triple E's, in terms of the local community to have an ownership. But what's in place to actually enable individual home ownership in terms of construction companies building homes that then these new young professionals can actually own? Because once they own that, you're actually now giving wealth down to the people that we've been talking about. There's a lot of the discussion on the farming side, but that cannot develop until you have a vibrant economy and a vibrant spending culture where people are actually owning property which become assets and allow them to actually grow their personal wealth. I tend to worry that we have a conflict that is not very clear.
Yes. Thank you very much. Definitely, by way of introduction, I didn't go much into housing, not because it is not important, but basically because I was just outlining a framework of discussion. And in matters of housing, of course, housing and urban development is a topic that has been ignored above all by economists, and I'm one such. So as a parting shot, as I was leaving the United Nations, I wrote a book on the issue. See, I joined the United Nations to work on trade, but Mr. Kofi Annan said, no, you have to work on housing, because he wanted an economic perspective of the sector. So I would like to give you my book. I will give it to you after this. You can look at it since you are working in housing. And it is a neglected sector. But in matters of fighting urban poverty, it has got to be a leading sector in the urban economies. Because definitely the opportunities for absorbing, creating employment that I talked about earlier, if it rises anywhere, it rises also not only in tourism, but also in the construction sector. Putting up affordable homes for the people who have to come into the urban areas. This is really work that is hurting there to be done. But I must say that very few economic schools discuss housing. And that's why I've contributed this book, meant for economic schools. Economists, they study rural, agricultural, industrial interface, and you name it. But there is very little discussion of the spatial dimension of development. So we have really to look at municipal finance, affordable housing, housing finance systems, etc., etc. I talked about 70% and even more of our people being in slums and squatter settlements. Is it any surprise in a country where you don't have even a single building society? If you don't have a housing bank, if you don't have a mechanism for housing finance. The good news is, as a government, we are working on it. So my ministry, working with the central bank and the treasury, we are trying now to put up housing finance mechanism, a facility where you can access basically affordable capital. Because the capital here, the interest rates, if you are in real estate for the developers are faced with a series of challenges. Because on the one hand, the mortgage systems are underdeveloped. So even if you develop houses, you might be confronted by ineffective demand. That's one challenge. But also there is a question, of course, of the cost of capital to deliver affordable homes. I think you will agree with me, if you are going to have a double-digit interest rate, 15%, 18%, the amortization schedules simply don't work out. The loan becomes too expensive, given the relatively low levels of income. So now, I would like to say that we are promoting this, but solving housing problems is also a finance sector. So working very closely with the central bank to put up a mechanism to enable developers to come into the picture. A lot of progress has been made. For example, the mortgage finance laws have now just been enacted. They were not in existence before. So there was no foreclosure law, for example. And that, of course, was constraining a lot of private sector participation. With the number of millions, we have a deficit of about 3 million housing units in deficit. So for the private sector, this could well be the place to go, provided we as a government also create an environment which is enabling and conducive for private sector participation. So basically, I agree with you. In terms of availability to land, now, I did say that land belongs to the villages. But of course, we have the Urban Planning Act. Once an area is declared as an urban area, then the land automatically converts into the public sector. So the government has the right to alienate this land and take it for itself for urban development. So urban land is in the public domain. We have a mechanism for that, of course with fair compensation. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting you mentioned that one of your issues that you're looking at is affordable housing, and you're hoping or expecting the private sector to develop. One of the key, very weak areas is construction permits. It takes on average 326 days, one of the highest in the world. So it goes hand in hand. If you want the private sector to be part of that development, regulations, and that has to be speeded up as well.
I agree, it is definitely a challenge, but also, of course, I did talk about capacities, and here, some of the development partners, these sectors, because, why did I write this book? Because the sector is not understood. Initially, you couldn't find it in the World Bank supported, country assessment, for example, strategies, or the United Nations development assistance frameworks, because housing is a complicated sector, and there is very limited understanding of it, and it is so resource intensive. And normally, I think in the traditional economic tradition, it is seen as a consumption sector. The devil take housing sort of theory, because it just absorbs foreign exchange. It does not seem to create employment. There is a misunderstanding. But now real estate has since moved on. I think we have multinationals, real estate developers, Wade Adams and company. They are all here managing buildings. So it has been an evolution of economic thought and understanding of this sector as the leading sector, while agriculture will definitely lead the rural countryside. But housing does have a place to say, and it is also a repository of national wealth. 72% of American gross domestic product is in mortgage finance, secured by only two firms, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So you don't, little wonder that there was a crisis when things didn't go very well with the subprime mortgage in America. In fact, I can vote that, thank God there was very little understanding of this in the public domain. There would have been a run on the banks. If people had all these details, to imagine that 72% of American gross domestic product is insured by two institutions, I think you saw what happened. Nobody was sleeping in Washington to sort out this sector. But while the developed nations have a handle on housing policy and investment, in the developed countries, it is really left on its own. And this has got to change. The incentive sectors, the transaction costs, now there are problems of capacity. Working for the UN, I visited a lot of China. In China, we have now farm service centers. In China, you have construction service centers, where you can go in, find an engineer or an architect, but this is the place where you have to figure out everything on your own. And if you look at the issuing of, to go back to your question, issuing, for example, construction permits, this is delegated to our municipal authorities. To be honest, the capacities are very limited. So this is where also donor assistance could be of great importance. And it is very frustrating, I know, for the contractors, for everybody who wants to get on with their business. But we have problems of capacity compounded by the neglect of the sector because of very little economic understanding of it so far.
Thank you very much. One final question.
Thank you, Your Excellency. My name is Emily Schaefer. I'm the commercial officer at the U.S. Embassy. So on behalf of my American investors, I'd be remiss if I just didn't speak up for them. I find with our American investors who come in, the land issue just over and over again. I hear it with American investors coming into my office, and I realize you've only been on the job a couple of months, but just to let you know, investors often complain that they have seemingly beneficial projects that would benefit smallholders, that would create jobs, that would provide affordable housing. I have several examples. I won't name their names. But they find themselves waiting like 2 years for a plot of land, getting frustrated, and they don't, TIC is supposed to be their one-stop shop, but they find that TIC doesn't have enough land. We've heard about this land bank, but still not come after many years of talking about it. And we are aware that there's plans to electronically map, to GIS map and electronically update all the land registries, which is great, but that takes a lot of time. So just wondering, in the meantime, like right now, where can investors go for help when they can't get land for their projects? And people find themselves going from TIC to the Ministry of Lands, to the Chief Secretary, even at State House, to the Prime Minister's office, which is now in charge of investment. So where can they go, you know, right now before all the years it takes to do all the broader reforms? Thanks.
How do they work the maze?
Thank you very much. You have raised a very valid concern. Yeah. And I can say that my ministry is seized with the matter as it were. We are aware, and as I said, first of all, only about hardly less than 10% of our land is surveyed. And that which is surveyed, I must admit that our registry is not, you know, what it should be. So there are serious challenges. And of course, if you look at in the spatial technologies, they have gone so far. So we should really be able to fast track this, provided, as I said, we realize that this is important. And I have seen, sitting in the lands ministry, I have seen a lot of investors who are finally coming from the TIC back to the Ministry of Lands. So I think that the most valuable thing that an investor might have is his time or her time. So we are working very hard now, together with the TIC people, the investment minister, to see that we can have a uniform policy, which is transparent, which reduces really the time spent on negotiating something that in the end we might declare at the Ministry of Land that actually doesn't exist. This is my response to you, and I'm really hoping that it shouldn't take us too long before this is sorted out, because it's also in national interest that we move openly and transparently and reduce the frustration. You cannot have a one-stop center if you don't have policies, right? Because one-stop center is born of transparency and efficiency, so that you move quickly. At the moment, on the land issue, there have been some delays because we are sorting out this very aspect.
Thank you very much to both our speakers, Your Excellency. On that note, we will end this session, and I'll just close with a few briefing words. Okay, very wide range of issues we covered today, from infrastructure, energy. I mean, it was clear in almost every session, in some way or the other, it crept in. The Prime Minister neatly summed up two of the major requirements for Tanzania as part of his advancement to development. They were power production and transport infrastructure. Only then will Tanzania be truly able to take advantage of its strategic location? Everybody agrees in this room that this is an important part of East Africa. Natural resources, combined with land, water, and now we're looking at agricultural development. So it goes beyond just mining and oil and gas. So you need to look at it much more closely beyond that. However, at the same time, the government still needs a lot of work to do to make that happen. And at various points, we've heard various ministers emphasizing the need, a little defensive at times, but at the same time, going away with things to think about. So that was very encouraging as well. Improving the business environment, it goes again hand in hand. It cannot happen by itself, and it certainly cannot happen just by the private sector. The government has to do more. We talked about that endlessly at the first summit, again at the second summit, and I'd like to think a little less at this summit, but no. We've also gone back to the old issues. But it's encouraging to see that investors are not abandoning this part of East Africa as well. EAC is another positive factor, and everybody recognizes that. So hopefully EAC will speed things along as well. So lots of work to do, financing as well. And to end, opportunities beyond mining and housing, agriculture. Things have to be speeded up, particularly construction permits as well. So on that note, before we wrap up, we'd like to thank all our sponsors, PR agencies and the delegates for their support, and above all, of all the panelists and the ministers, and particularly the Prime Minister as well. Thank you very much. And we'd like to now invite you to an informal networking reception. But for those who cannot join us, have a safe journey, and hopefully see you next year. Thank you. It was very good. Very good. It never worked.